Creating a successful drag race car, there's a lot that goes into creating a successful drag race car design and engineering, having the right driver, securing the right funding, and ultimately following the right basic principles in construction. Throughout the sport's great eras of experimentation in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, a few successful designs helped to create the look and feel of the sport we know today. But there were far more machines that tried and failed to change the game. In this video, we're going to look back at 5 cars that made their mark on the drag racing landscape, but instead of gaining fame for their successes, they will forever be infamous for their failures. In one case, the fundamental flaws were corrected, but in most others, the mistakes made in their creation led to them becoming paperweights or worse, scrap iron. The Syndicate twin-engine front-motor top-fuel dragster. Most hardcore lovers of drag racing history know that the early 1970s were a time of revolution in top-fuel drag racing. While rear-engine dragsters had always been part of the sport, the debut of Don Garlitz's car at the start of the 1971 season, Swamp Rat 14, marked the beginning of the end for the slingshot dragster as the premier style of acceleration machine in the top rank of the sport. One team was late to receive this news and debuted one of the largest, and definitely the last, freshly built twin-engine front-motor top-fuel dragster the world would ever see. The Syndicate team of fourth-man Rate Boak and Demar from California had been reasonably successful campaigners of a single-engine slingshot in the 1960s. In 1971, they commissioned race car specialties to build a car they felt would take them to the front of the pack. The machine that left RCS was a behemoth. It had an amazing 250-inch wheelbase, packed 2 blown 392 Hemis on nitro, and was effectively a dinosaur from the second it hit the racetrack. The additional engine did not overcome the weight disadvantage it brought to the table, and after competing for most of the 71 season and the very start of the 72 season, it was retired, never to be seen again. Unfortunately, performance numbers for the car are scarce, but it was not competitive, and the team scrapped the idea when they realized they would never overcome the disadvantages of weight and physics. The car was eventually recreated in perfect period form and now exists as a Cacklefest car, complete with a beautiful paint job. This car was a full 3 feet longer than the 25-inch wheelbase Don Garlitz used in Swamp Rat 14, the machine that revolutionized the sport and rendered the Syndicate obsolete before it had ever turned a tire in anger. The Hemi-Cuda La Plymouth dealers. In previous videos, we've looked at the truly insane 1965 season with respect to the rocket-like evolution of the Nitro Funny car. Once again, we look at that same year, but this time we focus on a car that did something few, if any, others had done at that point in the sport's still nascent history. It took flight. Lou Baney was relatively new to the ranks of the La Plymouth Dealers Group in 1965, but he was not new to drag racing or hot rodding. He certainly understood the marketing potential that a nitro-powered Plymouth could bring to the youth of Southern California. Rather than simply copying Bob Sullivan's idea of putting a top-fuel engine in the nose of the car, he collaborated with the crew of BM Automotive, specifically Bob and Don Spar, to build the car with the engine in the back. This car was not intended to be a wheel stander, but to be the fastest full-bodied car in the world on the drag strip. The car's exterior remained 100% stock. It used a tube axle and leaf springs under the front end, with an engine mounted in the rear cradle, solidly attached to the frame with no suspension. The engine, a real ground pounder built by the legendary Dave Z, was leaned on slowly during its first outing at the 1965 Winter Nationals. The car went quicker and faster each time down the Pomona strip, reaching about 140 mph after a few runs. Unfortunately, at its next outing at Lyons Drag Strip, disaster struck. As driver Tom McCann pushed the car harder than ever, it achieved a speed of around 150 mph before taking flight in front of an astonished crowd. A late-run wheel stand caused air to build up under the car. And despite McCann's efforts to brake and deploy the parachute, the car flew into the air, barrel rolled like a fighter jet, and landed on its roof. The car skidded through the lights on its roof at nearly 140 mph, setting the headliner on fire before coming to a complete stop. The car rolled again, snapping off 3 of the 4 wheels, but eventually stopped right side up, utterly destroyed. Despite the crash, McCann walked away unscathed. The story doesn't end there. Benny lobbied the dealers into building another Hemi-Cuda. The new version had a blocked-off front grille, a vented rear window, and revised suspension. The front end was lowered, giving the car a downward rake. The rear cradle, which had held the engine, was now suspended and pivoted in a way that forced the front end down under acceleration. McEwen, proving his superhuman levels of courage, drove the second version, achieving mid-9-second runs at speeds over 160 mph. He drove the car for most of the 66 season, and it was then taken over by fearless Fred Goy. Living up to his nickname, Goy ran the car exceptionally hard, nearly reaching 200 mph, and impressively earning a win at the 1967 Hot Rod magazine meet, running 8:56 at 186 mph to win the 2400 lb supercharged experimental stock class, beating Gas Ronda in a camera-powered Ford Mustang. So in the end, maybe this one wasn't such a big failure after all. Pancho Reinon's wedge next, we go to 1971 and the US Nationals to talk about Connie Kalitta driving Pancho Rendon's wedge rear-engine top fuel dragster. Of all the weird aerodynamic errors in top fuel racing, the wedge era of the early 70s was the weirdest. These wedge cars were built by various chassis builders and tried by some of the biggest names in the sport. Even Don Prudhomme. Every single one of them was a dismal failure, but none failed as spectacularly as the one Connie Kalitta tried to drive at the 1971 US Nationals. The story goes that fellow Michigander and well-known car owner Pancho Renin came to the 1971 Nationals with a brand new wedge-style top fuel dragster. These machines had normal-looking front ends but featured huge triangular-shaped sponsons starting at the driver's area and running over the rear tires, supposedly to produce more grip and stability. Kalitta, who was primarily at the Nationals to run his funny car and that of Shirley Muldowney, was approached by Renin in the staging lanes and offered the seat of the race car. This happened on Thursday at the Nationals, and Kalitta took the offer to drive what would be the first rear-engine car of his career. According to reports from people on the scene, as Kalitta made his way down the track, he had to pedal the race car. When he did, the Detroit locker unit in the rear end of the machine became unlocked, sending all its power to one wheel and resulting in a catastrophic crash. The car wrecked mercilessly at the top end, striking the signage and wind light indicator at the finish line and being decimated in the process. The photos of this crash are indescribable. The only portion left intact was the area Kalitta was sitting in. Despite being transported to the hospital, Kalitta returned to the track the next day, qualified his funny car, and made it to the semifinal round, where he lost to Ed McCulloch, who went on to win the US Nationals in 1971. The wedge cars, if not already on the way out, were written off pretty quickly after this disaster. Ford Super Mustang total performance era. There are so many aerodynamically based failures in the 1950s and 60s of drag racing, so why choose this one? Well, it's because of the names attached. During Ford's total performance era, they typically came into motorsport with a budget and resources designed to vaporize the competition at any cost. At this point in history, their drag racing program was shaping up to be very strong. They were investing heavily in their Cobra Jet program, which would go on to be a powerhouse. The single overhead cam engines were a horsepower match for the Hemis but lacked durability. With this in mind, when a group of engineers decided to tackle the issue of building the ultimate dragster, they dove all in. Despite supposedly being built off the books from Ford's knowledge, the Super Mustang had many advanced ideas. The body was designed in a wind tunnel, and given Ford's track record of taking on Enzo Ferrari on his home turf, they thought they could handle the hot rodders too. Wrong. The Super Mustang was anything but. When the car showed up at the 1967 Winter Nationals, it was beautiful in space age, but the major problems surfaced as soon as Tom McEwen hit the gas. Using an injected rather than supercharged engine of more than 500 cubic inches, the car was forced to run in double a fuel dragster against blown machines. The Super Mustang had an independent rear suspension, coilover shocks, and an anti-roll bar. Its beautiful body was like a cinder block around its neck, producing high 8-second elapsed times when dragsters were already running in the low 7s. The car was beautiful but slow. Beyond that, the cool-looking bubble top forced a driving position McEwen described as nightmarish. He was squashed so tightly into the cage he effectively didn't fit. After the 67 Winter Nationals, the car was parked in a Ford warehouse and never raced again. Thankfully, the machine was saved, completely restored, and now resides in a car collection. Gary Gabelich's mid-engine Monaco four-wheel drive Vega station wagon nitro funny car. Gary Gabelich is a true hero of American speed who deserves his own full biographical video, but for now we focus on the most ghastly and reckless machine he ever drove. This is saying something for a guy who set the world's land speed record in 1970, traveling over 622 mph in a rocket car, and who had been a test jumper for the Rockwell Corporation during the space race, leaping out of capsules on the edge of the Earth's atmosphere. Fearless, his machine was, on paper, the most advanced drag racing car ever made, certainly up to 1972. It was four-wheel drive, had an aluminum monocoque-style chassis, used a blown nitro-burning Hemi built by Ed Pink, and was just 41 inches tall at the roofline. It was also the most expensive drag racing car ever built to that point, costing over $238,000 in today's money. Paul Sutherland and Al Willard at Sutherland's Race Car Works built it, and it was truly like nothing created before or since in drag racing. Unfortunately, the mechanical masterpiece had one of the most disastrous ends in the sport's history. During a closed session at Orange County International Raceway designed for media to see the car and get action shots, complete disaster struck. Depending on the account, the car either did an awesome four-wheel burnout and the throttle stuck upon launch, or Gabelich decided to take it on its first true run. Either way, the result was the same. As four-wheel drive drag racing cars tend to do, the machine shot across the racetrack, smashed into the guardrail on one side, blasted across to the other side, suffered another massive impact, and caught fire. The car flipped, rolled to a stop, and was completely destroyed. With no medical personnel on hand, Gabelich's life was in danger. He had a compound fractured leg and a nearly severed hand. Loaded into a friend's station wagon, he was sped to the hospital. In a stroke of good luck, a surgeon specializing in attaching severed extremities was able to reattach his hand. His leg was so broken that metal rods were inserted to make it whole again. This was the last serious race car Gabelich would ever drive. The car was not repaired, and no one has attempted a similar design of drag racing car since. Some four-wheel drive cars have been built, but none were mid-mounted, monocoque chassis designs. This seems like an idea that should never be replicated. Conclusion: failure in drag racing. Perhaps the most interesting part of drag racing history is that it's built on failure. A racer's failure to win drives them to try something new. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. A design's failure to be competitive leads other racers to avoid it and seek a more reliable path. In the end, these failures have led to the ideas and concepts we see in modern drag racing today. Many people have opinions on how homogenized modern drag racing categories have become, but the simple fact is, the cars look, perform, and are driven the way they are because these designs work. The Wild West nature of drag racing in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s will never be repeated. Innovation in modern times tends to happen incrementally, but smart people wake up every day, envisioning ways to go quicker and faster than ever before. Drag racing isn't done innovating, it's just doing it in a more subtle way that requires close attention to notice. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe for more historical and automotive content.